This is the number that stopped the argument cold: 515 feet. A boat-shaped formation on a mountain in eastern Turkey, measured at almost the exact upper end of the biblical ark's reported length, sitting in the wrong place, under the wrong kind of rock, surrounded by the wrong kind of silence. For decades, that should have made it easy to dismiss. Then modern scans, soil tests, and subsurface mapping started pulling up details that did not behave like a normal ridge. And once those details were stripped of all labels and looked at cold, without the words Noah or Ark attached to them, the problem only got worse. Because the first thing you have to understand is that this story is not really about faith, not at first. It is about classification. A shape appears on a slope, long, narrow, tapered at both ends, roughly 157 meters from tip to tip. If you're careless, you call it a miracle. If you are cautious, you call it a geological feature. If you are serious, you ask a colder question. What does the object actually do under measurement? Does it behave like terrain, or does it behave like structure? That is the whole fight. And it is why this mountain has become one of the strangest battlegrounds in modern pseudo-archaeology, geology, and belief. For generations, the public version of the Noah's Ark search has pointed to one name above all others: Ararat, the great snowbound peak, the iconic mountain, the one that dominates paintings, documentaries, children's Bibles, expedition posters, and endless failed searches. That mountain has consumed decades of effort and delivered almost nothing universally accepted in return. Ice, weather, stories, photographs that collapse under inspection, claims that flare up and disappear, but the formation that keeps pulling researchers back is not on the summit of Greater Ararat. It sits farther south, near Mount Tenderek, in the vicinity of the village of Uzungili, close to the Iranian border. That matters, because from the very start, it puts the story in tension with its own legend. The locals have their own history with the slope. Long before online videos and radar images and viral headlines, people in the valley were pointing upward and calling it a ship. That does not prove anything. Human beings are brilliant at seeing meaning in shapes. We see faces in clouds, animals in constellations, patterns in static. But local memory matters for a different reason. It tells you the formation was strange enough to earn a name before modern publicity found it. Then, in the mid-20th century, aerial photography made the problem visible to outsiders. From above, the ridge stops looking like an ordinary scar on the mountain. It starts looking unsettlingly deliberate. The image that ignited the modern legend entered the world after Turkish military mapping flights brought the formation to wider notice in 1959, and the object took on the name Durupinar. That was enough to trigger attention, but not enough to settle anything. A ship shape in mud is still a ship shape in mud. The world is full of accidents that mimic intention. So the next layer of the story became measurement. The formation was reported at around 164 meters in some surveys, roughly 538 feet, though other proponents focus on about 157 meters or 515 feet, depending on where the boundaries are drawn. That range matters because 300 cubits, the biblical measure for the ark, can be converted in different ways. Use one cubit standard and the match looks loose. Use another and the fit looks disturbingly tight. That is where people usually make the first mistake. They hear that number and decide the case is either one or laughable. But numbers do not behave that way. They do not hand you meaning. They hand you tension. 515 feet is not proof. It is a pressure point. It is a detail that refuses to disappear. And once that detail existed, every later survey inherited it. Every geologist, every skeptic, every believer, every documentary voice had to step over the same number, 515 feet. Too clean to ignore, too ambiguous to trust. A measurement standing there like a locked door. The mainstream explanation formed quickly, and to be fair, it has real weight behind it. The conventional view is that the Durupinar Formation is a natural geologic structure, not a hull, not fossilized timber, not an ark, a shaped mass of rock and debris altered by slumping, earth flow, erosion, and the peculiar geology of the region. A 1960 expedition involving Turkish authorities and outside experts concluded there were no visible archaeological remains and no convincing reason to treat the site as a man-made vessel. Later, geological critics argued that the supposed structure could be explained by limestone, mudflow processes, and the way sedimentary layers and weathering can trick the eye into seeing frames, walls, and curvature where none were intentionally built. That explanation deserves to be stated plainly because it is not foolish. It is what careful science should say when extraordinary claims arrive early and evidence arrives late. The trouble is that time did not leave the site alone. New technology did what it always does to old mysteries. It made them worse. Ground-penetrating radar, resistivity surveys, LiDAR, soil chemistry comparisons, and renewed public attention started reopening a question that geology had wanted closed. Not because any one result proved a buried ship, but because taken together they began forming a cluster of anomalies. And clusters are dangerous. A single strange reading can be ignored. Several different strange readings pointing at the same footprint are much harder to wave away. So imagine the coldest possible test. Remove the Bible, remove the tradition, remove the name Noah, remove the emotional payload, feed in only the physical file. A 157-meter elongated formation with bilateral tapering. Internal lineations reported beneath the surface. Multiple parallel anomalies. Soil chemistry inside the footprint differing from the terrain immediately outside it. Vegetation contrast across the same boundary. A topographic object isolated enough to attract a name from local memory and repeated enough in its geometry to invite measurement. If a system saw only that file, what would it call it? A random ridge, a known erosion pattern, or something anomalous enough to demand closer classification? That is the frame that changed the story for a new generation of researchers. Not the old question, is this the Ark? The colder one. Does the natural-only explanation still explain all the data at once? Because it is one thing for geology to explain the outline. It is another for geology to explain the outline, the internal lineations, the symmetry, the chemical boundary, and the persistent room-like interpretations, all in one sweep without forcing the answer. That is where the public claims became explosive. Supporters of the site began arguing that subsurface scans showed right angles and linear structures around 7 meters below the surface. They talked about repeated internal divisions. They talked about what looked like layered zones. They talked about chamber-like signatures. Critics immediately pushed back and said those images are interpretive, not decisive, and can be read as natural layering and jointing in rock. That argument sounds technical until you say it in plain English. The same scans that one group sees as compartments, another group sees as geology. The same lines that one side calls structure, the other side calls stone. And yet the reason this has not died is that the lines are there. Even the skeptical response is not, there is nothing unusual. The skeptical response is, there are unusual things here, but there are non-Ark explanations for them. That is a very different place to be than the old easy dismissal. The mountain stopped being boring. That alone changes the tone of the case. Then came the soil work, and that is where the story picked up a new rhythm. Not because soil can identify Noah's Ark, it cannot, but because boundary effects matter. If two nearby patches of ground sit on the same mountain under the same climate, with the same recent weather, and one consistently shows different chemical behavior, you have to ask why. Proponents of the site have highlighted findings of roughly 3 times more organic matter within the boat-shaped formation compared to surrounding areas. That sounds dramatic because it is dramatic. Critics answer that a different underlying rock type, better water retention, and a bowl-like shape could naturally produce greener growth, richer soil, and higher organic buildup. Again, the problem is not that one side has data and the other has none. The problem is that the same data supports 2 very different stories. And this is where the mystery stops being a children's tale and becomes something more interesting. Because the worst-case scenario for certainty is not lack of evidence. It is evidence that refuses to behave cleanly. The soil does not let the believers celebrate. The geology does not let the skeptics relax. You end up in a tighter place. A place where the object is either a remarkably suggestive natural formation that mimics deliberate structure in several different ways at once, or a buried human-made or at least human-modified feature embedded in a geological setting that has hidden its origin so completely that every new test becomes a fight over interpretation. 515 feet. 3 times the organic matter. Linear anomalies below the surface. A shape that tapers like a hull. That is the rhythm. That is the pulse of this story. And the first hard reveal is not that anyone proved an Ark is in the mountain. It is that the old line, it is just a ridge, no longer does enough work on its own. A plain ridge should not keep returning the same argument from different directions. Not outline alone, not chemistry alone, not subsurface imaging alone. All of them together. That does not mean the Ark has been found. It means the simplest dismissal may have expired. If you want to know the moment this stopped feeling like an easy coincidence, stay with me. It is coming up. Because the next layer is what the public loves most, and what the evidence supports least cleanly. The interior story. Viral tellings of this case now circle around claims that cameras were finally inserted into drilled openings, and that what came back was so unsettling the team went quiet. Room-like spaces, partition-like surfaces, straight lines where nature should not easily make straight lines, dark openings at regular intervals, a beam-like feature above, silence in the tent, people stopping interviews, footage withheld. That story is almost perfect for the internet. Too perfect. So here's the cold part. Publicly available, independently verified evidence for dramatic interior camera footage is not solid. Some project material describes robotic camera exploration of voids and chambers as part of planned operations, but the most sensational claims spread far ahead of what has been rigorously released. That should weaken the mystery. Instead, strangely, it sharpens it. Because when the viral noise gets stripped away, the underlying question survives. If the dramatic interior footage is overstated, why does the site still refuse to disappear? Why are serious geological objections still having to answer fresh rounds of public data? Why do proponents keep returning to the same measurable features instead of only trading in legends? The answer is uncomfortable for both sides. There is enough there to keep testing, not enough there to close the file. That is much worse for anyone who wants a clean ending. And then there are the stones in the valley below, the so-called anchor stones or drogue stones near Kazan. Massive upright stones with holes through them that believers have long associated with stabilizing the Ark in floodwaters. Critics answer that these are local volcanic stones, not mysterious imports, and that carving holes into stone is not the same as proving a Bronze Age flood vessel. Fair enough. But the reason those stones survive in the argument is not that they are airtight proof, it is that they widen the field. Now, the case is not only one boat-shaped formation, it is a formation plus a local landscape of objects that tradition has pulled into the same orbit. That can be a trap. Human stories love to gather fragments and glue them together, but it can also be a clue. Cultures do not preserve memory at random. They preserve what grabs them. A cold analyst has to do something human beings hate. It has to separate emotional coherence from evidential weight. Do the anchor stones actually strengthen the case, or are they just narrative magnets? The answer is probably both. They are weak if you need courtroom proof. They are strong if you are mapping why this site kept surviving in local imagination long before modern promotion. And that matters, because archaeology often begins where memory and material brush against each other, not because memory is perfect, because it leaves trails. Most trails go nowhere, a few do not. The site's modern mythology owes much to Ron Wyatt, and that fact alone makes many researchers flinch. Wyatt was not a formally trained archaeologist, and many of his broader claims have been heavily criticized or rejected. Yet he became one of the most influential public promoters of the Durupinar Formation, bringing samples, photographs, and an unshakable conviction that this was the remains of Noah's Ark. For academic critics, Wyatt became the perfect reason to dismiss the whole subject. If the loudest believer is unreliable, the site itself must be too. But that is not how evidence works. Bad advocates can attach themselves to real anomalies. Wrong people can be early at the right place. The site does not become geology just because one of its defenders oversold it. That is another reason the story has become harder, not easier. A formation, first popularized through sensationalism, later begins generating fresh technical claims. That creates a trap for the mainstream. If they dismiss everything because the older public case was messy, they risk ignoring newer data that deserves cleaner assessment. But if they engage too openly, they risk feeding a myth cycle that outruns the evidence. So everyone becomes careful, very careful. They lower their voice, they qualify every sentence. They turn certainty into fog. And from the outside, the fog looks exactly like secrecy. Now add the flood tradition problem. Not as proof, as context. Because the Noah story never lived inside one text alone. Flood narratives appear across ancient Mesopotamian material in the story of Utnapishtim, in the story of Atrahasis, in Greek tradition, in South Asian tradition, and in many indigenous memories around the world. That does not mean every flood story is a memory of one single event. Human beings live near water. Water kills civilizations. Great floods etch themselves into culture. But the reason these parallels keep returning in Ark discussions is that they remind people of something unsettling. Myth and memory often share a border. And on that border, reality does strange things. It splits, it blurs, it survives in fragments. The Durupinar case feeds on that border. If the object is natural, then it became one of the most powerful projection screens ever found, absorbing a global flood myth into a real mountain shape so persuasive that generations kept reading vessel into stone. If the object is not wholly natural, then the opposite becomes possible. A memory survived because something physical anchored it, not the whole Bible vindicated in one sweep, not a cartoon boat full of pairs of animals suddenly wading under Turkish dirt. Something subtler, an event, a vessel, a remnant, a core memory around which legends calcified. That is why the phrase hidden interior hits so hard, even when the evidence around it is contested. Because once people believe there is an inside, everything changes. An outline can be mocked, an interior cannot. An outline is a silhouette. An interior is architecture. It means design. It means intent. It means someone made decisions there. Decks, beams, partitions, chambers. Those words are radioactive because the old explanation has a much easier time with the outside than the inside, and so the site's entire emotional force now hangs on that transition, not shape to scripture, shape to structure. Public advocates for the site have leaned hard into that transition. They describe repeated linear features, possible voids, and evidence consistent with enclosed spaces. They describe drilling programs and increasingly sophisticated non-invasive study. Critics answer that the scans are still being overinterpreted, that raw geophysical data is not the same as direct visual proof, and that limestone and earth flow can create misleading patterns. This is the exact point where a cold analysis style becomes useful because it forces a discipline the human mind does not like. You do not ask which story feels bigger, you ask which explanation accounts for the most observations while assuming the least. When you do that, the pro-arc case gains and loses at the same time. It gains because the formation is not random noise. It has persistent measurable weirdness. It loses because the jump from weirdness to arc remains massive. The skeptical case gains because natural processes in complex geology really can generate startling shapes and misleading subsurface signals. It loses because each fresh anomaly has to be individually absorbed into that explanation, and the cumulative burden keeps growing. What you are left with is not proof, it is strain. One explanation straining upward toward the extraordinary, the other straining downward to keep the ordinary intact. 515 feet, still there. 3 times the organic matter, still there. Right angles and lineations reported beneath the surface, still there. A site long dismissed, still refusing burial, still there. And then there is the silence around the most dramatic claims. Online versions of this story love to say the footage has not been released because what the team saw was too destabilizing, that researchers stopped taking calls, that individuals vanished from the conference circuit, that a tent went quiet. Some of that may be embellishment, some of it may be ordinary project drift, institutional caution, funding friction, or nothing more sinister than the way fringe-adjacent research shuts doors once attention gets too noisy. But the reason the silence matters is not because silence proves a hidden truth. Silence creates a vacuum, and vacuums fill with inference. The less cleanly the site is explained in public, the more powerful every absence becomes. That is the turn in this story. Not the moment someone shouted Ark, the moment neither side could close the file without cost. If geology wins, it has to explain why this one natural formation seems custom-built to trigger structural readings from multiple angles. If the Ark hypothesis gains ground, it has to cross one of the hardest thresholds in all controversial research, moving from suggestive non-invasive data to direct, independently verifiable, peer-scrutinized material evidence. Carbon dating, published stratigraphy, confirmed material identification, not vibes, not narrative, not a shape in a drone shot, the real threshold. And that threshold is where almost every legendary discovery in history either became real or collapsed. The world does not change because a mystery sounds convincing. It changes because samples survive scrutiny. It changes because independent teams can repeat a result. It changes because an object stops being a story and becomes a data set nobody can explain away. The Duruppinar formation is not there yet. That matters. But the equally important truth is that it is also not back where it was. It is not just a joke from a bygone documentary era anymore. The object has migrated into a harder zone, a zone of repeated claims that require better refutation than mockery. Before I show you what the coldest reading of this really implies, if you are new here, this channel exists for exactly this kind of moment, when the data stops agreeing cleanly with the textbook. Because here is the coldest reading. The most unsettling interpretation is not that Noah's Ark has obviously been found. It has not. The most unsettling interpretation is that the official explanation may be too small for the object now sitting in front of it. Not false in every part. Too small, too eager to flatten a layered anomaly into one word. Natural. As if that word ends the conversation. It does not. Natural can describe a process. It cannot erase a pattern. If a pattern keeps returning under measurement, then your job is not to scoff. Your job is to classify it better. Think about the two competing narratives. One says the mountain is holding a remarkable but ordinary geological structure that happens to mimic a ship and gather misleading signals. The other says the mountain is holding the remains of an ancient vessel linked to one of the oldest flood memories on Earth. Both are extreme in their own way. One stretches natural coincidence to a point that makes people uneasy. The other stretches historical survival across millennia in a way that would force archaeology, religion, and public history into the same room. That is why this feels larger than one site. Because whatever wins here changes more than a map pin. Now add time. If there ever was wood here, the clock has not been kind. Whatever organic structure might once have existed would not be sitting in neat museum condition. It would be altered, mineralized, crushed, infiltrated, and blended with the mountain that buried it. A real ancient vessel, if one existed, would not look like a boat from a movie. It would look like a geological argument. That detail matters more than most people realize. It means the very state of decay people use to dismiss the site could also be exactly what survival would look like after thousands of years under pressure. In other words, ambiguity is not the enemy of the Ark hypothesis. In some ways, it is the expected environment of it. But ambiguity also protects bad stories. That is the danger. Once a claim can hide forever inside uncertainty, it can survive any criticism. That is why the bar has to remain high enough to stop fantasy, open enough not to kill inquiry. And maybe that is what has made this site so magnetic for so long. It sits exactly where human beings are least comfortable, between ridicule and revelation. Too strange to ignore, too weakly settled to trust. A perfect engine for obsession. So, what happens if future testing gets better? Imagine narrower questions replacing larger ones. Not, is this Noah's Ark? But what exactly are the reported subsurface lineations composed of? What is the age and origin of the higher organic content? Does the internal footprint stay consistent across independent scans by teams with no stake in the legend? Are the boundaries geological or structural? Are the so-called room signatures continuous or fragmented? Does any retrieved material show clear anatomical wood microstructure or only mineral mimicry? These are not dramatic questions. They are the only questions that matter, because the big reveal in any mystery is almost never one grand answer. It is whether the small answers start leaning the same way. If they do not, the story dies slowly. If they do, the story gets dangerous. And that brings us back to the hidden interior. The internet wants a chamber. It wants a passage. It wants the moment the camera crosses from dust into design. Maybe that moment already happened and is being exaggerated. Maybe it has not happened at all in any verified way. But psychologically, the idea is irresistible because it turns the whole mountain into a door the ancient world closed and modern instruments are only now finding the edge of. You can feel why people become reckless around that possibility. The interior is where belief stops being metaphor and starts risking contact with matter. There is another reason the story lands so hard right now. We live in an age where old claims are constantly being rerun through new machines. Aerial scans, pattern recognition, ground imaging, spectral analysis, topographic modeling. History has become searchable in ways older generations could barely imagine. And every time a new tool touches an old mystery, the same hope returns. Maybe the machine will cut through human bias. Maybe it will confirm what tradition guessed. Maybe it will expose what tradition invented. That hope is everywhere now, in archaeology, in astronomy, in forensic history, in the search for lost cities, buried rivers, erased roads, shipwrecks under sediment, forgotten battlefields, collapsed temples. The machine is witness, cold, unimpressed, indifferent to what we want. That is why the format works so well. Not because AI is magical, because people trust a neutral process more than they trust a narrator. If a storyteller says this site is compelling, you can dismiss the storyteller. If a blind process keeps flagging the same anomaly, you have to fight the anomaly instead. That is exactly what has happened at Dirupinar. Not in a published final form, not in a courtroom clean way, but in the cultural sense, yes. The site keeps getting fed back into colder systems, and it keeps returning as unresolved. Not solved. Unresolved. That distinction is everything. And maybe that is what is worse than we thought. Not that someone finally reached inside and found a perfect wooden ark. The evidence does not support saying that. Worse than that. The closer the measurements get, the more the old comfort evaporates. This was supposed to be one of those stories modern analysis quietly kills. One more legendary object fading into geology. Instead, each round of attention seems to peel away one easy answer and replace it with a harder question. The site does not get clearer. It gets more resistant, more layered, more expensive to dismiss honestly. 515 feet. The number is still there. The shape is still there. The chemical contrast is still there. The internal claims are still there. The counter-arguments are still there. And the distance between those two stacks of data is where the real mystery lives. If the next round of testing produces direct samples that clearly identify ordinary geology with no credible structural origin, the case will not vanish overnight, but its center of gravity will finally shift. The legend will keep going. Legends always do. But the object itself will start to cool. If, on the other hand, the next round produces independently verified material that cannot be explained as natural layering, weathered volcanic minerals, or ordinary sedimentary structure, then the story detonates. Not because a Sunday school image becomes history overnight, because a site long trapped between myth and mockery suddenly gains a material spine. That is the big reveal, not certainty, exposure. The possibility that what terrifies institutions is not a miracle, but a file that refuses simplification. A formation sitting in the ground that keeps surviving contact with better tools. In science, that is how difficult truths announce themselves at first, not by conquering the world in one day, by refusing to go away. And there is something deeply human in that. We like to imagine that knowledge moves in clean lines. Primitive belief, then advanced understanding. Story, then science. But real history almost never behaves that neatly. Sometimes a culture preserves an event in the language of myth because that is the only vessel it has. Sometimes science arrives centuries later and finds not proof of the myth, but the residue of the event that fed it. Sometimes the opposite happens, and science strips the residue away, leaving us with a story powerful enough to outlive its object. Both outcomes tell us something about ourselves, about memory, about pattern, about the need to anchor meaning in the physical world. If the Darupanar Formation is only rock, then it may be one of the most psychologically potent pieces of rock on Earth. A natural object that seduced generations across belief lines, drew surveys and counter-surveys, and kept reactivating the oldest flood imagination on the planet. That alone would make it worth studying. If it is more than rock, then the implications spread far beyond religion. It would mean human beings may have been preserving a transformed memory of catastrophe far longer, and with far more stubborn material grounding than modern arrogance likes to admit. Either way, the case matters. And that is the part people often miss. You do not need a final Ark verdict for this to be one of the most interesting unresolved sites in the world. The object has already done enough. It has exposed how fast ridicule becomes caution when measurements accumulate. It has exposed how easily belief outruns evidence. It has exposed the weakness of both lazy dismissal and lazy certainty. Most of all, it has shown that one mountain shape, one stubborn set of numbers, and one cluster of disputed anomalies can hold an entire civilization-level argument inside them, about what counts as evidence, about how stories survive, about whether the ancient world was always more literal than we think, or whether we are still more myth-making than we realize. So what are we really looking at on that slope in eastern Turkey? A collapsed vessel turned stone, a natural formation shaped by earth flow and wishful thinking, a cultural mirror built out of rock and repetition, maybe all three in sequence, a strange object first named by local memory, then mythologized by global attention, then pressed between better tools and older beliefs until it became something more dangerous than either side intended. Not solved, not dead, just standing there, forcing everyone who approaches it to choose between overclaiming and underseeing. And that may be why every new attempt to close the case creates more heat than light. Because the mountain is now doing what the best mysteries always do. It is revealing the observers as much as the object. The believer sees confirmation. The skeptic sees projection. The careful researcher sees a messy file that deserves better than either reflex. The public sees a door in the earth and wants it open now. But truth does not move at the speed of appetite. It moves at the speed of evidence, and evidence, when it is real, is patient. Somewhere under all the noise, that patience is the story. The patient shape on the slope, the patient measurements, the patient disagreement, the patient refusal of the site to become either miracle or joke on command. We keep returning because we sense something there, even if we cannot yet name it cleanly. A conflict between legend and matter, between what the world remembers and what the ground will allow us to prove. Very few places let you feel that conflict this sharply. So when you hear someone say, scientists finally reached the hidden interior, slow down. Ask what was actually seen. Ask what was released. Ask what was measured. Ask what was inferred. Ask what critics can explain and what they still have to handwave. Ask what proponents can support and where they leap ahead. The truth is probably smaller than the viral version and larger than the dismissal. That is usually where reality hides. And maybe that is the hardest thing to sit with. Not the possibility that Noah's Ark sits inside a mountain. The possibility that our oldest stories and our newest tools are now staring at the same object, and neither one can fully absorb it yet. Sit with that. Because if the next phase of work reaches the threshold that all serious, controversial sites eventually face, material identification, replicated scans, clean publication, independent review, then one of two things happens. Either the mountain closes the legend at last, or it opens one of the most uncomfortable chapters modern archaeology has ever seen. Not because it proves every flood tale on Earth, because it proves that somewhere inside all that inherited memory there was more contact with reality than our neat categories were prepared to allow. And if that happens, the object on the slope will stop being a curiosity and become a dividing line. Before the data hardened, after the data hardened, before it was safe to laugh, after the laughter got expensive. Until then, the formation remains what it has been for decades now. A wound in the earth shaped like an answer, a number, 515 feet. A disputed interior, a test case for belief, geology, and the limits of dismissal. Worse than we thought, not because the conclusion is obvious, but because it is not. Because the closer we get, the less permission we have to be simple about it. What do you think? Geological coincidence, or a site that the official explanation still has not fully caught up with? Tell me below. And if you think there is more being missed in old data and older ground, subscribe. The next clue is usually already sitting there, waiting for someone to measure it cold.